Well, hello and welcome to episode 71 of It's Never Sunny in Seattle. We are back in 2023. It's the Seattle Mariners podcast. New year, new flow, and we have a special guest today, Baseball America's Geoff Pontes, friends of the podcast. How are you doing, Geoff? I think we're doing good. I'm happy to be back on the pod with electricity and internet now, which is always a good thing. No more windstorms in Sammamish. And we have a lot to talk about today. The Mariners have made some moves, some big, some small, some minor league, some major league. But Geoff is here today to talk about the fabled, the industry-wide famous Baseball America prospects list and where some of the Mariners prospects might find themselves. I think we should start there. Geoff, what are the big names for the Mariners and where do they rank?
Sure, yeah. I think we'll sort of start backwards on this one. Guy that I really, really pushed hard to get onto this list and was one of my favorite pitchers actually in the 2021 draft class. I didn't care about the age. I think if you watch Bryce Miller pitch at all, you sort of just generally understand what's good about it. It's a great operation, low release height. The fastball itself has a combination of power and movement. It's a good sweep and slider. He throws the changeup, relatively well. In addition to those two, doesn't really need to show it this much. I think as he moves up, it's obviously going to be a bigger question. A lot of relief risk initially put on Miller, but I think based on the performance last year and just the quality of the fastball and the slider and the fact that he does have a couple of like fringe to average additional secondaries in the curveball and the changeup that he can show. He's one of my favorite arms in the top 100. On my personal list, he was like just outside the top 50. I absolutely love Bryce Miller, and I'm happy that he's been pitching well and continued to improve because I kind of was out in an island a little bit when I had him ranked within like the top 40 players in that 2021 draft class. Other guys that are on the list, Cole Young, just got a lot of good reports. One of these guys in this class, and there's a few of them in this shortstop class, wasn't as tooled up as the 2021 class, but there were a lot of guys with sort of advanced hit tools, good baseball skills. Jet Williams is kind of another one that's there. Mikey Ramiro, kind of another guy that fits into that category. And then Cole Young. I'm not 100% that he's going to necessarily stick at shortstop. He certainly got the arm for it. The actions, hands, all that sort of thing, reflexes, all really good. If he ends up at second base, especially in this, new age, and we'll see how the shift impacts it. But I think second base is probably going to tick up in terms of athleticism back to something that we saw years ago. A guy like Young is certainly incredibly valuable, especially when, his hitting ability can run a little bit. I think there's projectable power there as well. Now, is it 25 or 30 homer pop? No, but if you have a guy who hits for a high average with 15, 16 home runs, hits a lot of doubles, moves along in the bases, plays good defense, it's a really valuable player. But I think the other guy, that obviously is there is Harry Ford. He's at 64. So 199 are where Miller and Young, they just slip onto the back end of the list. Highest ranked Mariners prospect is Harry Ford. Great combination of athleticism, baseball skills as well. Plate skills are strong. He doesn't ever really chase. There's good bat to ball skills there. He's not a big guy, but it's explosive bat speed. And I think he's one of those guys that, due to bat speed and leverage and just barrel control, he'll probably hit for a lot more power than you would expect based on the body. You look at sort of the strength and the athleticism that's there. This is a guy kind of like Dalton Varsho where you could even see him as an outfielder long-term or moving to third base or something like that and having being a really valuable player. I don't think any of these guys are obviously like cornerstone type of players. You had one of those that came up last year in Julio Rodriguez. But I think they're all really nice supporting pieces. And, considering the Mariners have graduated as many prospects as they had and traded prospects, pretty good ones, for players that, impact the major league team, I would say, they've done pretty well, and Dipoto continues to, balance, I think, pretty good draft classes to go along with, a very competitive, young, exciting major league team.
Yeah, I think I saw some data last year where, I kind of flagged Bryce Miller as someone that was really interesting and to watch. And I think back then it was still like I think he was addressing, the command control issues. But he's someone that, we really love as a collective. Um, I've seen data, and I think you have access to True Media, um, that he throw like a 20, IVB out of a 5.5 vertical release. Like those numbers are pretty nutty. Like the numbers that I've seen are really, really nutty on his fastball. And obviously command matters, but I mean, based on the data I've seen, like it looks like it could be one of the better fastballs of starting pitchers in MLB if he does start.
Yeah, and I have the best. So I did the best pitches in the top 100 article last year. We're breaking it down into like I jokingly call it a limited series, like for HBO, where I'm going to just separate it and do a best fastballs article, best curveballs, best sliders, best changeups, and then best pitch arsenals. That's going to come out each day throughout next week. We're starting off on Monday with the best fastballs article, and Bryce Miller is number 2 in the minor leagues behind Gavin Williams. I think there's an argument stuff wise. He has the highest stuff plus rating on his four seam fastball in the top 100. The performance numbers were just a little bit better with Gavin Williams. Just looking at isolating like Wobicon, things like X Wobicon, etc. Where I can not look at like the whiff stuff, which like all these guys obviously miss a lot of bats with their four seamers if they're considered the best fastball in the top 100. Just a little bit better than Miller, but yeah. I don't have access to True Media, unfortunately. That would be tremendous, but I do have, some source contacts that allow me to see some data, ask about certain players, and get bigger data sets that I can study, which is obviously helpful. But Miller, I mean, I don't know if he actually averages 20 IVB on the fastball. That's what the number says. I tend to think that anytime I see 20 IVB, I'm like, it's probably a little high. But the minor league systems are significantly better than like what you see in college, which is just like juiced up beyond belief. I mean, I've seen 25 IVB fastballs that were strikes, and that's not possible on the Cape. Like that doesn't happen. But mound heights and things like that can kind of vary from park to park. You don't have sort of that standardization that you have in MLB. So some of those numbers can be a little juiced. He's definitely over 19, which is elite. So that's really all that matters. When you sit 94 to 97 miles per hour, legitimately touched 100, and can ride it up like that with command. I mean, he throws the pitch, nearly 70% of the time in for a strike. So and his chase numbers aren't like crazy. So a lot of it really is legitimately like in zone whiff. He's pretty high. He is somebody that absolutely can just kind of jam it down the middle and get whiffs, frankly.
I feel like the hype for Bryce Miller is getting a little bit out of control, not only on this podcast, but just in the Mariners sphere in general, where I think people are kind of setting an expectation for him potentially to become like a frontline starter. And this kind of dovetails into a question that was asked by one of our listeners, which was by Meow Mix, saying, what is a realistic career outlook for Bryce Miller? I thought, just kind of to add context to that, I thought it was interesting that you said that none of these three players for the Mariners are, in your mind, like cornerstone franchise level players. But so I guess that means that you don't necessarily think that Bryce Miller has a realistic ceiling of being a frontline starter. Do you think that that's correct?
Yeah, I would say, role wise, you'd be pretty happy with like a number 3 here. That maybe like, he's not like a huge innings eater. He's not somebody that's going to go like 190 to 200, but like a 5 inning starter, maybe racks up like 140 to 160, throughout the year, and, you know, generates a lot of strikeouts, and sort of gives you, he's never like within that like elite pitcher tier, but is always a pretty consistent mid rotation type guy. That's sort of how I see him. And there's plenty of starters that are viable out there that get paid a whole heck of a lot of money to sort of fill that role. But I don't see him sort of transforming into like Verlander or Sandy Alcantara or even like a Kevin Gaussman or someone along those lines. But I think like sort of what like Kyle Wright is, I think probably wouldn't be a bad outcome. They're very different in how they sort of get there, but I'm just saying like stat line, Joe Musgrove, like that would be like the high end of what I would see for Miller, where it's probably more realistic that he's a little bit below that. But I think he's answered a lot of questions around starting. And I think the fact that his pitch types are what they are, being like a top of the scale fastball. Like personally, like with some of the 80s that we put on it, I think Miller's fastball was better than DL Hall's fastball, which got an 80. I would have put a higher grade on it. The other thing is he's got a sweepy slider that he commands, and that's a slider that you can throw in zone. I mean, that's not like a gyro slider where you're trying to get like heavy chase pitches. It's always going to be a little bit more like split heavy, platoon heavy, but he does have feel for that changeup, and I think as he throws it more, we'll see. You know, it's a pretty effective pitch, and then he'll throw the curveball early in counts and give you sort of a different look. It's a good overall arsenal, and frankly, like when you look at the quality of like his movement on the mound, how consistently he repeats his mechanics, and then just some of those elements to his release, like he's someone to be excited about. Like I think that he's underrated sort of within the national sphere versus some other guys. Like he's essentially what like the Rangers and a lot of people thought like Jack Leiter was going to be. He's kind of a better version of that, frankly.
It's interesting that you make that comp because actually Joe Doyle made that comp on Twitter like a week ago. He said that he thinks that Miller is better than Leiter and Rocker in particular, that there'd be a lot of demand for him. I was actually really surprised that so much of the conversation around Brian Reynolds this offseason did not center around Bryce Miller as the trade piece. I think the general consensus is that, like you even said with the Baseball America top 100 rankings, he is ranked 100th. And so like, just anecdotally and in terms of the industry, like that just isn't as valuable as if he was artificially higher, but he may be in a position to skyrocket depending on how this year goes. I am really interested to see where the Mariners start him because they have been so hesitant to put their ace level pitching prospects in AAA at all. I think George Kirby has exactly one AAA start, and I believe Logan has 4 innings. So in terms of like their more recent guys getting any exposure at that level, I think it's going to tell us a lot about how they see his readiness if they pitch him in AAA. And then the flip side of that is the Mariners have another prospect, first overall, first round pick that hasn't debuted and that we're not talking about at all yet, which is Emerson Hancock, who didn't find himself on the list. Jeff, we had a listener question for you, which was, what is Emerson Hancock's new ceiling and floor? Does he still profile as a major league pitcher, or is him not being on the Baseball America prospects list really just a recognition of how rough it's been for him so far, or is there a thought that maybe he's just not a major leaguer anymore?
I think he's probably still a major leaguer. I think you look at like he didn't have an awful season. He just doesn't miss like a ton of bats. He gets weak contact. He's a right-hander where his predominant secondary is a changeup. It's a solid fastball. It's okay. Probably a little bit above average, mostly because of velocity. It's not super hoppy. It's not quite a dead zone fastball, but it's kind of teetering on that line, if you know what I mean, in terms of, its combination of, and I know Mikey does, the vertical break and horizontal break. It's not a great shape. It's a little bit lower release because he's not like a huge guy. So it does have some elements that aren't bad, and I think that's probably why it gets that 55 grade consistently from scouts that we talk to. And I think just even looking at the data kind of backs that up. But he doesn't have that elite fastball or that elite pitch that Bryce Miller has. And Bryce Miller also has like a slightly worse changeup, fine, with like a much better breaking ball. And I think that's always a concern for me is like, how many pitchers are there in the major leagues that are starters that are right-handers that are changeup first, that are successful, that don't have like an 80 changeup? I mean, like there's relievers like this, but there's not a lot of like frontline starters sort of in that mold. Now, you told me Emerson Hancock is a guy that, throws 170 innings a year as a number 5 starter and like your fan base bitches about him when he pitches like 60% of the time and he always gets hot for a month and a half. Like everybody has one of those guys. He's exactly that. Like, I just don't view him as somebody who's going to be super impactful outside of being like a reliable back of the rotation sort of option. He has velocity in that changeup. Maybe against left-handed heavy lineups, he might be like a good option out of the bullpen, but I don't think they're going to be looking to move that guy and the amount of money and the pick value that they spent on him. I don't think that draft capital is going to push him to the bullpen this soon, unless he was throwing 100 with like a hammer and he doesn't. So I don't know what to make of Emerson Hancock, because like personally, just like watching their pitchers last year, because something I do when I'm not at the ballpark, I try to tune into as many games as possible. I'm on the East Coast. I get to see a lot of West Coast games when I get back from the ballpark. I think Taylor Dollard is a much better pitcher. I don't think his stuff probably is better. But just in terms of like the execution and his ability to sequence, and the slider too. Like I much prefer Dollard, honestly. But it's not my list, and we obviously don't just base our lists on our opinion. We go out to scouts and front office folks. We talk internally and externally on the organization with guys that have coverage and get a more robust sort of opinion and data set to base our rankings off of. But I think Dollard's more interesting, frankly. Like, it's not as loud, but he can pitch, he can execute. I don't see him necessarily as like this guy's going to be a reliever. Like the guy could be a number 5 starter and need a bunch of innings and maybe like have some seasons where you're like, how does he have a 3.75 ERA when his stuff isn't as loud as like Matt Brash or whatever. It's like, just pitching's weird. Baseball's funny, man.
Yeah, the Mariners are saying Colin McHugh for Taylor Dollard. That's like their internal comparison. My like headcanon comparison for Emerson Hancock has been Homer Bailey, because Homer Bailey was also a very similar pick. He was the number 7 overall and Hancock was number 6 overall. Do you think we're kind of along those lines there with Emerson Hancock? Are we on the right track there?
Yeah, I think just in terms of like expectations versus reality, it's certainly not bad. If he gets to the major leagues and has as long of a career as Homer Bailey, I don't think that's not like a giant L.
I think when it's all said and done, I mean, I don't think they're similar pitchers per se, because I think they both have pretty high arm slots, but I think like the output might be somewhere in between like Chris Flexen and like Miles Michaelis or something like that, like a pretty low. And I think the thing that I'm wondering, because I think what's going to be the deciding factor is like, if a secondary pitch does take a step forward, but I think it's going to come down to contact, deadening and suppression more than missing bats. Because I think we all know, I think that he's not going to really miss that many bats.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'll throw another name out there that personally, I'd probably like, if I had to rank them just by watching them, not looking at numbers, anything, I would probably have Brian Wu like second in this system in terms of pitchers behind Miller. Like, just in terms of what I like, it's it's like butter smooth operation, really easy repeatability. It's a lower release height. It's not like super outlier or anything like Miller's is, but it is fairly low. He gets a nice shape on the fastball, kind of heavy bore, so he's getting ride, he's getting run, and he commands it. I mean, I think the secondaries probably need to take a step forward, but it's a really good fastball, and I really like to watch him throw it. So, I got to see Wu twice in AFL, and he pitched pretty well for me both times, as well as Adam Macko, who then got traded, but I hated Adam Macko. Guy's throwing his 69-mile-per-hour curveball, man. I see that, and I feel like I'm watching a Cape game.
You may have already answered this, but we had a question from B who wanted to know, do you think that there is a sleeper pitcher in the Mariners system? And you mentioned Dollard, obviously, and you mentioned Brian Wu, but is there anyone else who might be a little more under the radar that you're interested in?
You put me on the spot here, man. I gotta think about this one a little bit. I mean, like, is Prelander Baroa really like a sleeper? I mean, I could name him, but he's in the top 10, and there's people who
Durs is smiling.
Sleeper starter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he's a starter. I have no idea. It's a nasty fastball slider combination, though. Come back to me on that though, because I feel like there's somebody that they drafted like recently that I love that I just can't pull out of like thin air right now.
Fair enough. Well, let's talk a little. We talked about Bryce Miller. We talked about Dollard. We talked about the pitching a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about Harry Ford, who is actually the Mariners' highest rated prospect and a first overall draft pick. He's had really kind of an interesting track so far because he got injured in his first season, but he did manage to put up some pretty interesting numbers, played really well last year, has kind of skyrocketed up. I actually feel like 64 is, I don't want to say inflated, but it is higher than I expected him to rank so far just because he kind of hasn't played at a high enough level or with enough pop just yet for him to like really be on this list, but he is, which seems to be kind of indicative that both his pedigree from where he was drafted and just the general consensus about him as an athlete seems to be that he's a really good major league player. We talked to Joe Doyle about him a little bit when he was drafted, and there was a sense that like, they might move him to third base or second base, or the Mariners seem pretty committed to him as a catcher. I'm wondering what you think, how that affects his timeline, because obviously they'd be accelerating him a little more if he wasn't working on the defense. But what do you think his timeline is getting to the major leagues? And how do you think that impacts maybe the way the Mariners look at their Cal Raleigh and how they maybe negotiate with him going forward?
Yeah, I'd say he's probably like 2 years away from like the majors consistently. Like I wouldn't expect him to have a full-time role until like 2025. The thing about Ford is I think when you look at what the ceiling is, right? This could be a guy who is an above average hitter with elite on base abilities, probably plus bat to ball skills are pretty close to it. Average power, maybe a little bit better because he's going to grow into more strength. I think when you look at his frame, how hard the dude works in terms of like off the field, he's pretty yoked up. Like I don't think he's close to max because like you hit a certain point and he has that body type. Like when he's 26, 27 years old, he's just going to be like a little bit stronger and thicker. Like your muscle matures. You just like, it's true. Like, your muscle doesn't really sort of like peak until you're like in your late 30s even. So like he's going to be lean. He's going to not lose much like pliability. He's going to be a guy that moves pretty well, which I think probably projects well for his swing. You look at the numbers overall. I mean, I know it was low A and you can talk about Cal League Parks, etc. Guy just gets on base. He rarely gives away an at bat. He runs really well. There is explosiveness in the swing. Will he get into more power? Sure, I think so. Was some of it Cal League aided? Probably. But if I remember, some of the parks that he was playing in, I think particularly Modesto doesn't play great for homers. So that probably didn't boost it as much as like, if he was playing in like some of the other parks in that league that absolutely like help you out, like Fresno, Fresno used to help a ton. And then like, it's Fresno. I'm trying to think of where the Rockies were playing their games because that's what I was watching consistently. Like it's definitely like a more power friendly park. I think the thing with him and like timeline with Raleigh, like by the time he's ready, Raleigh hopefully will have established himself as like an everyday catcher with like offensive upside, and maybe he's a valuable trade piece at that point. I don't know, or there's some sort of a platoon situation. The thing that's really attracted me about Ford is he could probably play a few different positions, and you could have sort of this versatile guy that can play some third base. He can play some outfield. I mean, he's athletic enough to play center field. I don't think there was any question about that. And I think even before he was drafted, that was a conversation because at the time Joe and I were working together on those draft rankings before I went to BA. We pretty much consistently agreed like this guy could maybe just be a center fielder. Like a team could take him and he may not even necessarily have to stick a catcher. But when you have a guy that's that athletic behind the plate, moves that well behind the plate, and can do certain things that other guys can't, with a strong enough arm that, I think it probably works. We'll see how it works with, I don't think we're going to get full robo umps, but whatever that future looks like where, maybe some framing stuff is less important than it used to be. I don't know if I fully buy into that, but we'll see. He throws well enough and he hits well enough that I think you're going to want to keep that bat in the lineup. So he's an exciting player. And I think one of the reasons he's boosted as high as he is there's that projection there, but there's also baseball skill. And I know for myself, and certainly a lot of the executives, et cetera, that we talk to, when a guy has a premium defensive position and as he goes down the defensive scale, I don't know if it's such a detriment to Ford's profile if he did end up at third base, if he did end up in center or right field. He still holds a lot of value, right? And you look at the plate skills, the contact, some of the exit velocity data, which is pretty good, especially the top end stuff for his age group and bucket. You're like, hey, this guy really has sort of like a starter kit to potentially take a big step up and develop into more of an impact prospect. I think he's the only guy in this system that has that sort of upside that you can probably squint a little bit and be like, I could see Harry Ford being like a 280 hitter with, a 12% plus walk rate and 25 homers that plays a few different positions. Like, I mean, that guy's worth a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, you saw what teams were willing to give up for Dalton Varsho, and this is kind of like what you're outlining is almost like a better version of Varsho, because Varsho doesn't even hit that well in terms of contact skills.
Yeah, I think he's a better offensive player at this point, based on what Varsho was.
I wouldn't call him a generational athlete, but I have heard that some of his athletic testing for Ford has been someone used the word generational. It does feel strange to take an athlete like that, and I wouldn't say you're wasting him behind the plate because it takes a lot of athleticism. But especially with potential robo umps, it feels strange to not have him at especially center field if you can give him a go. And obviously you have Julio Rodriguez, but I think if you can move Julio Rodriguez to right field and then Ford slots into like center or something like that, that's pretty ideal. So I guess it's kind of a philosophical question, but do you feel like his athletic skill set is of better use, especially given his other skills elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that it was Loden Sports who does all the athletic testing for a bunch of college teams, pro teams. They used to do the PDP for USA Baseball that did those tests. And the guy that does those tests is a good friend of mine. So he chatted me a little bit, and it's what we would call a Loden 90. So, like, it's off the scale sort of athleticism. Guys that are like this, Spencer Jones fall from the Yankees, the big tall guy that got drafted this year that hits the ball like a 115 miles per hour consistently and is like a 60 runner at 6'7". That's what Ford is. I mean, it's just the opposite body type because he's a shorter guy, but he's so and what baseball athletic testing amounts to isn't like how high do you jump, how fast do you run the 40. It's like that sort of basic stuff that you would look at that has some application in football, has some application in basketball. It's about explosiveness. Baseball, whether you're throwing hard, hitting a ball, whatever it is, it's about the ability to be explosive. And he is a short guy who has the ability to be explosive. I think he like deadlifts some absurd amount of weight. I forget what the number was, but it was like a gym record in like his high school or whatever. And I think he was he might have been a state ranked like power lifter. I know that like his squat numbers are insane. Like it's like twice his body weight. This is a guy that's a 60 runner and has a 60 arm and has offensive upside. Like, hell yeah, I would definitely move that guy off a catcher because I don't want his hands to get beat up. I want that impact in the outfield. And it's not like outside of Julio Rodriguez, it's not like the organization is like super deep with impact outfielders. Rest in peace, Jarred Kelenic,
I feel like we should ask you about Jarred Kelenic. Yeah,
Bro, I ranked him above Wander Franco in the pandemic. I want to blame it on the pandemic. Like, he looks so good. I don't think it's even a skills thing. I legitimately don't think it's a skills thing. I think it's a him thing. I think that whatever it is that's going on, it thinks snowball on him. And I've pretty much heard that as things start to go bad, they really go bad for him. And that's unfortunate because I think you look at the player, you look at what he did in the minor leagues at a very young age, consistently hit. Like when he was feeling it, man, like nobody could get him out. And he's had very few periods of success like that. Because I don't think it's not bat speed. Like, I don't know. I just don't. It feels like he's always caught in between and just hasn't gotten his footing yet. I almost wonder if a change of scenery, he ends up in like Cincinnati in a year, goes pull heavy in one of those parks, starts to feel it, and we finally see like the real Jarred Kelenic. But yeah, I mean, I almost feel like the body backed up too. Like he got like more bulky and like stiffer, and he's not Tyler O'Neill. Like he doesn't have Tyler O'Neill's athleticism. So he couldn't sort of carry that weight and still be an effective player. And it's probably a negative at times for Tyler O'Neill, frankly. But I don't get it, man. I wish I had an answer, because if I had an answer for what was wrong with Jarred Kelenic, I'd probably be getting, $500,000 a year to work for the Mariners and follow a Jarred Kelenic and figure it out. Because if he had a great, like if he unlocked it and became the guy we thought he was coming into 2021 next year, the Mariners are going to win. They're going to be better than the Astros. They're going to win the AL West, because he'd be a superstar. But I just don't think it's happening. At this point, you take like a 50. You'd take an average everyday rate. You take Cole Calhoun. You'd be like, thank you. I'll take Cole Calhoun. Like, that's fine. Just please be a productive player. I don't know what it is, but I've mostly heard that that he's just really intense, and that things really snowball on him, and that he hasn't handled failure well.
Do you think then that like even a 50 outcome is possible for him? Because if the problem for him is like a mental skills thing, then like it would either be going really well or it wouldn't be, right? Like would there be a world where like it's going okay, and like I just struggle to see that outcome in my head.
People mature at different periods in life, right? And I know this is stupid to say, but I think it's an element that's underrated, particularly with prospects, right? Because they're all human beings, and getting to the major leagues is really hard. And then being successful when you struggle in the major leagues is really hard. He could come back this offseason and start whatever it is, like just has a different perspective. A family member gets sick, he falls in love, something like that. Like things like that can put things into perspective and allow you to be looser. So I don't want to say that it could never happen. Because people do, I guess, the expression is people don't change, but at the same time, we do evolve. And, I think he's so young that to write off that if it's an emotional sort of thing with him that he can't get to where he needs to get to, I think is probably silly. Maybe it doesn't happen in Seattle, right? Like there's a lot of guys that, they get moved out to other places and it sort of clicks, You just got to hope that it's, he stays healthy and can sort of figure out whatever it is that's plaguing him. It's not an easy ballpark to hit in either when you're struggling. You don't get. It's not like Colorado or, like I said, Cincinnati, where you get a lot of love with the balls in play. Like things drop, things sneak down the line that doesn't necessarily happen there.
He's an interesting candidate too to see some uptick in performance because of the new shift rule changes. I don't know off the top of my head how much that's going to impact him, but it seems like some. The only thing I would disagree with you on is you said it's not a skill issue with Jarred. I think that is mostly true. I think that the power is still real. If you look at his projections, he's still projected to hit more than 20 home runs in full-time plate appearances. Like he still very much has all of the tools that was projected of him, but his pitch recognition and just general plate approach sucks in his sub-major league. And, especially when he got called up mid-season last year, I think we saw what it looks like when he is playing well and is still being unsuccessful. And it's him striking out a lot and grounding a lot of balls into the shift. And I don't know what a version of that is successful looks like. We've had this conversation actually a lot with Lookout Landing because there's kind of a dichotomy of those of us who are sort of over him and those of us who still really believe that there's something there. And we're having a hard time figuring out where the average is going to come from, because even if he hits for all the power and the defense is good and he steals bases and he does all of the other stuff that really does make him very interesting. If he could even hit like 230, all the other stuff makes him a pretty valuable player when you add it in. But we're having a hard time getting over that 200 batting average hump. And he's gotta hit some balls that land in play. You know what I mean? Like, it was really rough, especially last year when he was the fourth outfielder coming out of camp, got pushed into playing time when Mitch got injured in literally the fifth game, and proceeded to go 2 for 37, something like that, and get sent down. So like, I said this on the last pod. I think what Jarred really needs is a little success. I think a little success would go such a long way for him. If he could have 2 solid weeks, like, he could snowball that into a good couple of months. But it's got to happen for him, right? He's got to hit some balls in play.
Yeah, and I think some of that is just approach based too. When you really start to break it down, and there's, we'll say 2 to 3% of pitches that you're chasing on that you can cut out by just saying, hey, don't swing at this particular pitch, like off the plate. And that can have an uptick in his contact rates. At this point, you're just looking for this guy to get above 70% in terms of overall contact. You're looking him to get below 30% in terms of chase. Once he's in that area, I think it's small differences. There's upticks in terms of, the quality of contact that's going to come from that. Where I think there's other guys that, are overly passive, and once they get up to the major leagues, like Spencer Torkelson on the outer half of the plate, that stuff becomes like much more of an issue. It's much tougher to learn to swing on a particular pitch than not to swing at it, as funny as that sounds. And, with some of these VR training systems, etc., there's been a lot of work off the field in terms of trying to, help the pitch ID side of the game. So that's an area, especially when you start to see, you get your 10,000 hours and you get your 1,000 plate appearances, guys start to see some gains in that area. I don't think he's ever going to be a 300 hitter, like maybe we thought, but yeah, I think there's a possibility he could hit 240 this year, above that 230 line, and be a productive player. I think it's just some of those small sort of improvements that just need to be made. And, I think it's easy to forget this guy turned 23 in season last year. There's prospects on our list that are like 2 years old.
I wanted to ask about methodology real quick. One of the things that I really admire about Baseball America is how aggressive you guys are, or how like unafraid to be aggressive you guys are, I guess is a better way of putting it. Jackson Churio really came on strong last season. You guys were rocketing him up the list, and you see that with several players. Gavin Williams was another example from the pitching side last year. And you were telling us off pod, that things evolve very quickly for prospects, and that things can change. A guy who's lower down the list may end up being a superstar, and a guy high up on the list may end up being terrible. So I guess my question for you is, how do you want people to look at your list? Like, what do you want people to take away when they look at the top 100 list? What is something that you want? How do you want people to view it, I suppose?
Yeah. And I think the thing that separates us versus places I had worked previously, and a lot of stuff that's out in the public space, is this isn't our direct opinions. Like, there are rankings that I have within the Cardinals rankings that I personally disagree with. I would have Cooper Jerpy 4. I would have Gordon Graceffo 5. But after talking to 5 different scouts that have Cardinals coverage, for professional teams, talking to the Cardinals internally, polling folks around the game, analysts, etc., looking at the data, we sort of come to an understanding of what the ranking is. And I bounce it off of a bunch of different people and get feedback, and then sort of structure it around that and find something that like maybe people have like a gripe or two with, but generally feel is within the right area. So obviously the difference between us and other sites, this isn't a knock on like a Fangraphs, for example, where like Eric Logenhagen is a very good public evaluator and does great work. The BP prospect team are like talented public evaluators. They have guys get hired from teams every single year for that reason. And they, but it's much more opinion based than like what we're doing, where it's really like straight ahead reporting. And that was something that I personally had to adapt to, because my previous 6-7 years of experience had always just been ranking like what I thought mattered, right? And I owned the site that I was at previously. So I was able to, more or less override other people's opinions quite often. So like more often than not, what was in those rankings was a reflection of what I thought, where now it's much more of like, this is what the industry thinks. And that's what we're trying to put out, and that's what we're trying to convey. And sometimes like things that people in the game think and know is very different than what's available in the public sphere and the perception of the greater consciousness. So like I think people like don't necessarily comprehend that. They think it's just like, oh, this is your opinion, this is Baseball America's opinion, where it's like, this is our reporting, which is why there's sometimes guys in the top 100 that are maybe a surprise or they're a little bit higher, because our feedback is so aggressive. And one of the things I think is really kind of fun and also funny from an outside perspective about like our emails before we put together the top 100. We put together the list. It's kind of our own personal lists plus the rankings that we do throughout the year, and there's a measurement system within those, based on the BA grade and the risk, etc. And then we send it out to every single GM in the game. And Jerry DiPoto gave us 4 pages. So like we get a really good feel from top decision makers how the best prospects in the game are viewed. And the guys that, we get, like Jackson Holiday, for example, among all the GM feedback, we got 8 or 9 move ups on Jackson Holiday, and we got some really lofty praise on him. That's a guy we're going to shove up the list. It's the same thing in like Jackson Churio. We also know that we did a good job when like nobody gripes about Gunnar and Corbin at the top. No one says a thing about it. All right, I guess we're fine. And it was interesting to even read like a lot of opinions where the consensus among the 3 top pitching prospects with Painter, Yuri, and Grayson was Painter won. And it was, those 3 guys very close, but at this point, Painter seems to be the preference of, GMs and front office types. So, it's a different process, I think, than what's out there, but and it's not necessarily something that we maybe hammer home enough, but I do think it's a differentiator that, a lot of times the guys who opinions matter are the ones that we're getting the opinions from. So, we want to be a reflection of what's going on inside the game, because that's what the value is. To subscribe to Baseball America and why I have a job is doing that reporting. And, I luckily, I think I'm a pretty good evaluator. I understand numbers, etc., things like that. But I had to learn to be a reporter when I came to Baseball America. And, fortunately, I have some folks like Josh Norris and JJ Cooper and Kyle and Carlos that really, make that transition pretty easy because they're great reporters themselves.
Yeah. I feel like just in this process, and this is kind of a 2-pronged question, but that at least like you're able to really just notice trends and teams that think differently or teams that are just maybe not very smart. So just, like, is that something that you notice, and that you have a pulse on, and B, really wondering, and I think we kind of know the answer, but like and this is a listener question, but like what the scouting industry's consensus about the Mariners system and their ability to develop prospects. So really not only like their player development, but also just like what it might be like to trade with them or work with them, or what teams think about them. Because this team's gotten a lot better in just a couple of years. And even, the Zips projections just came out, and I was looking at their last year's opening day roster, and I was like, God damn, like this team is so much better than it was then. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that, they have a pretty good reputation within the game. They won our organization of the year this year with Baseball America, and it was kind of a 3-way battle between them, the Dodgers, and the Astros. So I think that says a lot, right? That says a lot about how much they've progressed to catch up to those 2 teams to a degree in terms of player development. I think that's especially true on the pitching side, where they've had a lot of W's, whether, whatever happens with Emerson Hancock or not. They got Kirby and Gilbert to the major leagues, which are really valuable players. I don't know if you really want to count Munez as their development or not from the Padres, but they, Brash, they found a right role for him, but he's a guy they went and they acquired. And I think the transformation you saw with his stuff and the power really across like there's very few guys that come to the Mariners and don't add a few ticks of velocity, right? So I think knowing that they're able to sort of identify the low-hanging fruit, work on that very quickly, see sort of the fruit of their labor very quickly, usually in season, and then sort of work on the more, the more important, more difficult things in terms of sequencing, in terms of improving shape on pitches and things like that. I think the fact that they have Driveline pretty close probably doesn't hurt either. So they've kind of been on the precipice of a lot of things that are going on and have the ability to sort of utilize that sort of thing, which, I think is an advantage, frankly. I think on the hitting side, it's been kind of hit or miss. I mean, obviously Julio was a great development, but there's been some other guys that maybe haven't, or have regressed a little bit, haven't necessarily improved. They don't have as much of an identity on that side. I think they definitely do have an identity on the pitching side, where a lot of guys that throw hard and tend to actually have fairly good command. It's kind of funny. They kind of have this mix of like power and command that I think has kind of defined them a little bit. But when you look at where the organization is now, based on where it was like 4 or 5 years ago, I mean, it's improved by leaps and bounds. And I think you got to like their ability to identify players as well. The guys that are at the top of their system, even after having made some trades, are predominantly guys that they've acquired over the last couple of drafts. And they have some sleepers sort of later in this draft too. Guys like Hogan Windish, who I saw on the Cape right before the draft, can hit a lot. Tatum Levens, I think, is one of the more underrated college catchers in this class. He was actually at D3 LaSalle in Philadelphia and then transferred to Pitt. I saw him on the Cape in 2021 and then saw him again, I think, in 2022. Good leadership type, kind of like high energy guy, but I think legitimately like a good defensive catcher that can hit a little bit. He's a lefty bat. Windish was older, another guy that can hit. Josh Hood kind of had a really uneven sort of college career because he was at UPenn. His freshman year, he raked. Pandemic happens. Ivy League misses 2 years. The transfer rules change. He's able to then go to NC State. He was actually a 20th round draft pick of the Red Sox in that 21 draft, but didn't sign. There's power there. He can play a little shortstop. He's kind of an interesting prospect. They get the Vanilla Missile. Walter Ford, who's an interesting player as well. And then Mason McRae's favorite guy, Tyler Locklear, who just like rakes. I mean, dude hits the ball hard. There's contact ability there. Is he kind of lower, probably first base only, like on the defensive spectrum? Fine, but it's a pretty legitimate bat. So I think there's even guys looking at this list sort of their draft from 2022 and then thinking about what they could potentially add in 2023. This list could even look a lot different, and we could sort of see that next round of reinforcements, especially if some of these pitchers make a step forward, as we've seen a lot of pitchers in the Mariners system do over the last couple of years. So I think they've had some sneaky drafts. Like I think that's something that is sort of severely underrated. It's the reason the Dodgers are so consistently good every year is every single year, regardless of where they're drafting, they identify good players that their player development people sort of know how to develop. Like you have to find what that type is. Like the Orioles, for example, have figured out that we don't really care about contact as much as we care about guys that don't swing at bad pitches and hit the ball hard. If you have a high, ex-Wobicon and a really low chase rate, and you could play a premium defensive position, the Orioles probably like you. you could probably make a bet that that's probably the case, and it's worked out. I mean, they have a bunch of these guys now that are on top 100 lists that fall right within that category. Whether it's Gunnar Henderson, Jackson Holiday makes a fair amount of contact, but he never chases and he hits the ball hard. Judd Fabian's like that. Jordan Westberg's like that. I think to a degree you could probably make that case about like Joey Ortiz and Dylan Beavers. Like they had a whole draft class, the Orioles, of guys like this. So sometimes it's just a matter of identifying what it is that your player development people do well, and that player type that they can develop, and then getting them into your system and seeing what happens. So I think, kind of my long convoluted answer here is just like, yeah, they have a good reputation. They won our award for a reason. And I'd be pretty satisfied if I was a Mariners fan, especially versus my neighbors here in Boston who are all angry Red Sox fans at the moment.
Well, I would take that as incredible news. If you're looking for optimism about the Mariners, organization of the year, all those comments, I'd say you came to the right spot for some sunshine today, fans. So we're going to let you go, Jeff. We're going to wrap it there. That was incredible. Always great to talk to you. Always incredibly insightful. Come back on anytime. We'd always love to have you. I'm Evan. You can find me on Twitter at Evan James Audio. You can find Anders at Anders Jorstad. You can find Mikey at _Kuya Mikey. You can find Jeff, I believe, at Geoff Pontes BA. Is that right?
That's right.
Geoff Pontes BA. Find the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get podcasts, wherever it is you stream. Thank you to Zach Jabal for signing up for our Patreon. We love that. We love getting paid. Go Mariners. Please support the Patreon at patreon.com/neversunny in Seattle. Check out the Discord. We will leave the invite link to that both in the description here, and we'll post it elsewhere in the Twitter. Go Mariners.